Focus on clinical trials and what they are. So you've heard already this morning a lot about clinical trials. And all of the new treatment options that you heard Dr. Richards and Dr. Gajewski talk about actually evolved out of a clinical research study. And we have a lot of those discussions with our patients. And a lot of you have heard about clinical trials. A lot of you want to participate in clinical trials. And sometimes it's not always clear that you know exactly what a clinical trial is. So the goal is not to talk about specific studies right now, but rather to talk about generalities about what a clinical trial is, what's good about it, what's bad about it, what you should be asking about clinical trials when you go in, and then we'll sort of finish up with how do you find a good clinical trial or the right clinical trial. So first of all, I actually have given this talk before, and I started with this slide because I think we all know melanoma is a bad disease. I think we can all agree on that. And part of the problem in the past was we didn't have many good options. And we actually have more today, and that's encouraging. But of course we want more because we want to eventually be able to cure or prevent this disease completely. And the way that that's going to happen is through clinical research. So again, what I'm going to do today is we're going to talk about exactly what a clinical trial is, what the purpose is, and I'm going to give you some terminology because I often hear patients say, well, you know, I'll be in a phase 3 trial but not a phase 1 trial. And then I say to the patient, do you know what the difference is between phase 1 and phase 3? And they say, no, phase 3 is better, isn't it? And so the answer is not necessarily. So I'll tell you about what those are. Then we'll talk a little bit about the kind of mechanics of clinical trials and how they're actually done. And then, as I said, we'll end up with how you can get involved in clinical trials. Next. So first of all, what is a clinical trial? Well, it's a way to collect information or what we call data on various events, conditions, and populations. And so another way to look at it is sometimes we'll have a hypothesis, and the hypothesis could be something very simple, like we think a certain drug will have a benefit in patients with melanoma. And it's important to test that. So most drugs, before they come to clinical trials, have undergone a tremendous amount of research, in some cases 10 years or more. Sometimes this is done in cells in the laboratory. Sometimes this is done in animal models. And sometimes it's actually tested in patients with other types of cancer or other types of diseases before it necessarily comes to patients with melanoma. Ultimately, clinical research and clinical trials really help really make our world better. And we'll talk a little bit about the help that it may give to an individual patient, but it certainly helps us as a population to really understand things. And I think sometimes it's as important to test a drug to see if it doesn't work and quickly get rid of it so we can move on to something that is more effective. Now, some clinical studies test new treatments, but other studies are not what we would call therapeutic studies or treatment studies, but they may have other sorts of goals. So sometimes they could be something to prevent cancer or to prevent melanoma, and sometimes they can be to really look at quality of life or look at other factors. The bottom line is, just like buying a stock or a mutual fund, there's no real guarantee with a clinical trial. So at the end of the day, we're not really starting from knowing nothing. Things that get into clinical trials, as you'll see, really undergo a very rigorous process. So we're not taking just any old thing forward, but we often just don't know what's going to happen until we test it, not just in a few patients, but sometimes in a large number of patients. Okay. So again, typically the agents that come forward, once a clinical trial is actually written and presented to a patient, it has undergone an enormous amount of work ahead of time. And I think me and some of my colleagues spend a lot of our time when we're not seeing patients or in the laboratory really working on these studies. We go to meetings, we really talk about the best possible ways to put things together. In fact, we were just talking in the over lunch about exactly how to pick the best 2 treatments to put together and how we make that happen. Now, in addition, when we do clinical research, we actually have a number of ethical principles that have evolved, and it's important to keep that in mind. So not just anybody can do clinical research. There's actually a lot of training and credentialing that we need to go through. And as part of that, once a study gets through, there's been a lot of thought and a lot of oversight for how we protect subjects from going on studies. So although we want to test new things, we want new things to be developed, we also don't want people to get exposed to something that could be potentially harmful and at the end of the day cause more problems than good. We also want to control for bias. So bias is actually setting ourselves up for potential inability to really know what we've actually looked at. So for example, we could take a drug and just give it to everybody and get a sense of how they would do. That's a problem because we'll never know if that drug is necessarily really better than anything else that might already exist. So if a patient came in and said, well, should I get treatment with interleukin-2? Should I get treatment with a BRAF inhibitor? Should I get treatment with a new drug? We have to have some standards to understand that. And actually there's a very good example, and the example I would give is that of mammography. And understanding whether mammography is actually helpful to detecting breast cancer in women seems like it would be such an easy question to answer. And it turns out it was one of the hardest questions to answer. I'm not even sure we've completely answered it yet. And part of the reason is that despite a large number of studies that were done, all of them had a bias in them. So some of the studies, the staff tended to put women into the mammography group who had higher risk disease. And so that led to detecting more cancers because the patients going in that were not really getting screening, but they were really kind of getting diagnosed as part of the trial. Other studies did just the opposite. They tended to take those patients out, and it became very difficult to come up with an answer. So it really took an unbiased study to really be done to show that there might be a benefit with mammography. And we have the same problem sometimes when we set up clinical studies. We have to make sure that we're not biasing them. I can't decide that I think some patients should get this treatment, so I'm going to give it to them instead of the other patients. If we do that, we'll never necessarily know how effective a treatment really can be. We also, whenever you go into a study, you need to understand all of the aspects of the study. So part of our job, if we're running a trial, is to actually let you know all of the things that will happen to you, the things that are different than what would happen to you if you chose not to do the study, and what the other options are. So going into a study sometimes is a great option, and sometimes there's other options that may be even better. And finally, we actually use our statistical colleagues to make sure that we power our studies well. So we don't want to waste time putting patients on studies where we're never going to learn an answer because we just don't have enough numbers and we don't have enough statistical strength to really determine whether something good happened or it didn't. So why should patients consider a clinical study at all? Well, sometimes patients have already had everything else there is. So in melanoma, we didn't have many options. Now we have a lot more options. But even patients with other types of cancer, other diseases, sometimes will go through the different therapies. Sometimes they'll respond for a while. Sometimes they respond very well, and sometimes they don't respond. And there may not be anything else. So a clinical trial may be the next step. We also know that we need new drugs and we're getting new drugs. And sometimes access to those drugs is easiest and fastest if you do participate in a clinical study. Again, I can't stress enough that the drugs that come forward really are the best scientific thinking. There's not a drug company that I've ever heard of that really wants to put something forward that they think is really maybe not so good or going to fail. So they really do look very carefully at that. I think in the academic community we do the same thing. And so the drugs that do come forward that make their way is not everything. It's the best of the best. So that can be very good. I think another benefit is that when you go in a study, you get a lot of attention. So certainly at our center, although I have the world's best nurse working with me, when patients go on study, we actually use our research nurses, and you get a second nurse that can take a look at the patient. We may do more testing than usual. You may get to, you get so much attention. Most patients don't want that much attention, but we're watching you very carefully, maybe more carefully than we would otherwise, and that actually can be very beneficial for patients. I think an important thing to remember is that even if you don't get a specific benefit from a trial, you are helping everybody else. And again, the more we learn, the more we study things, the more we can advance the field. And so sometimes, really, I think at your core, if you're really going to do a clinical study, you have to remember that, no, you may not benefit, but you definitely will be helping other people. Some people will benefit, though, and I'm going to show you in a minute that actually many patients who choose to go on to study actually do receive a real benefit. And again, other patients will always benefit from somebody who chooses to participate in the study. Next. So why would you not do a clinical trial? What are the problems? Well, first of all, no matter what, when you go into a clinical study, the treatment is experimental. So that means that everybody always wants to know, well, what's the chance I'm going to do well? And a lot of times we don't know the answer to that. That's why we're doing the study, to find out. So again, we think it's going to be good, and sometimes we have a pretty good sense of how patients will do, but sometimes we really just don't have the answer to that, and we just can't give that answer. Likewise, many studies are designed to really understand what the side effects are. So if you've ever gotten a medication and your doctor or the nurse or the pharmacist tells you, well, these are the side effects, we learn that through clinical trials sometimes. And sometimes when things are in the early stages of development, we don't always know completely what the potential side effects are, and that could be a problem. Obviously, a lot of patients don't want to be a guinea pig, and before there were, I think, stronger regulations, a lot of times there were not ways to really catch side effects ahead of time, and patients did often feel like they were being guinea pigs. And although I think people coming to a meeting like this are interested in clinical trials, have kind of gotten over that, there's still a fear that you're just a guinea pig, that you're just being tested for, you know, a professor's sake or for a drug company's sake. You may need to undergo additional testing that you don't otherwise need to have. So oftentimes, as many of my patients know, we try to get as much blood as we can from them. We try to get tissue because we're really interested in learning as much as we can. And if you weren't in the study, no, we wouldn't be taking quite as much blood from you. And you know, it's obviously nobody wants to have more tests done than are necessary. And once in a while, sometimes when you go on a study, drugs are provided for free, tests are done for free, doctor visits are free, and that's great. Sometimes you have to pay for things, and that's something that it is your right to know before you go on to the study, but sometimes there can be additional costs associated with them. So next. So just to address the guinea pig thing and patients not benefiting, there actually was a very interesting study that was done on all phase 1 studies. I'll tell you in a minute. That's the first phase. That's the very beginning. And this is what I hear the most, that you really get no benefit in a phase 1 study. So there was a thinking that patients who chose phase 1, not only did they not get a benefit, but they're much likely to have a lot of side effects. Because, of course, this is when we're going to see the side effects for the first time. It's often the first time a drug would be tested in a patient. Well, it turns out there was a very large study done of over 10,000 patients that went on to phase 1 cancer studies. And it turned out that, in fact, although the expectation was that no one would respond, over 10% of the patients actually did receive a true benefit. And that benefit was either they lived longer, their tumor shrank, their quality of life was better, they had some tangible benefit. And it turned out that the death rate and the toxicity rate that was thought to be very high with phase 1 studies was actually extremely low. It was less than 0.5%. So it turned out that the conclusion of the studies was that actually patients who have cancer were benefiting more from phase 1 studies, and the real risks of going into these studies was really quite low. Next. So again, I mentioned there's a few different types of studies. So again, if you're getting a drug for treatment, that's sometimes what we call a therapeutic trial. That's different than a prevention trial. A prevention trial is doing something, whether it's taking a drug, getting a test like a mammography or a CAT scan or a PET scan, that tries to prevent or detect early a disease. A screening trial may be something to try to detect a cancer early. So colonoscopy has been shown to be very effective as a screening tool in preventing patients who have polyps from going on to getting colon cancer. We suspect that being screened for your skin, if you go see somebody like Dr. Rhodes ahead of time, may actually be very beneficial in preventing melanoma, although the studies on that haven't been conclusive yet. So I think we need to do more research in that area. There are also some studies that may be quality of life trials. So in addition to looking at the effect on somebody's health or disease, we want to know what the quality of their life is like. And that can be an important endpoint for patients. And finally, some studies really have nothing to do with treatment prevention, but they're really what we would call laboratory studies, correlative studies, biomarker studies. For my patients who've gotten interleukin-2, you know we're very interested in collecting blood to look for markers that might help us to identify why some patients do so well, other patients may not do well. And sometimes the goal of those studies is very different than a treatment study. Now, the other way, you'll hear phases of studies. Okay, so what is a phase really? So generally speaking, a phase 1 study is a very first time you're putting a drug into a patient to look to see what the side effects are and to see what the dose might be. So sometimes these are what we call dose escalation studies. So we'll start with a low dose and then we'll work our way up. Sometimes we do that in the same patient. Sometimes we use different patients to get different doses. Sometimes studies are done even before that, something we call a phase 0 study, to try to get additional information. So if we think a particular study, for example, might have an effect on a certain protein in the blood, we might do some earlier studies just so we can understand that better before we even attempt to put this into patients. And it gives us some ideas of what dose to start with, what dose to go to. Typically, a phase 2 study is when we know what the right dose is and we begin to have some knowledge of what the side effects are. Now we want to give the drug to more patients and sort of get a sense of how effective it might be. Many phase 2 studies are giving a large set of patients a drug, and increasingly we're doing what are called randomized phase 2 studies, where we may test 2 different things in a set of patients to try to just get a little more clinical experience with giving the drug. Typically, a phase 3 study is the last phase that's done before approval by the FDA. And this is when we want to see if the drug that we're dealing with is as good or usually better than whatever the current standard of care might be. So you'll see in a lot of melanoma studies, DTIC, which was one of the first chemotherapy agents approved, is often compared to a new drug. For example, Yervoy was actually compared to DTIC because DTIC was considered one of the standard of care drugs. So is it better? And if it is better, typically after a phase 3, the study would go before the FDA and it gets reviewed, and if it looks good, then the FDA can choose to approve it. Once in a while, we want to do additional studies with the drug, even though it's approved, after it's approved, and that's generally referred to as a phase 4 study. Next. So some of the other differences between these phases is phase 1 studies are typically smaller studies, so they may be looking only for as few as 10 patients. Sometimes phase 1 studies seem to be getting larger and larger, so sometimes I've seen a few that have up to 50 patients. They're usually pretty short, so the goal of these studies is to try to get them done as quickly as possible. We want to know the right dose, we want to know the side effects quickly. Really, the main purpose of them is a safety purpose, and the percent of drugs that successfully go through phase 1 studies is about 70% overall for cancer. So about a third of drugs will no longer be developed after the phase 1 because either the side effects were too great or they just weren't tolerated and they get terminated. So you can see the majority of drugs actually that come into the clinic actually will move forward. Phase 2, again, we're looking for more patients, and a typical size for these studies is somewhere between 50 to 150 patients. Because there's more patients and because the treatments may be a bit longer, it can take a while to do these studies. They may go on for a year or two. And again, they generally are used to get additional safety information, but the main goal of these is to really look to see if the treatment is effective. After phase 2, only about a third of the drugs will actually be shown to be effective enough to go on to phase 3, and so you can begin to see where there's some attrition. In phase 3, these are typically the largest of studies. Patient numbers may range anywhere from 200 to upwards of 1,200 to 1,500 patients. These typically may last several years. And again, this is looking at largely at establishing and confirming the effectiveness of this drug. And interestingly, about a quarter of the drugs that are going through phase 3 actually do seem to have a positive effect. Next. Now, most clinical trials will have a sponsor, and so sometimes if you listen to us and if you talk to the research nurses carefully, you'll begin to hear some strange terms. And so I wanted to just tell you what these mean, because they're really, it doesn't necessarily impact the potential benefit, but they're just worth knowing. An investigator-initiated study is one in which an investigator, like myself or any other physician, feels might be a good drug to test. Sometimes investigator-initiated studies are done with drugs that are being developed by an investigator. Dr. Gajewski, for example, has an active lab and is working on some things. He may develop something and want to test it. Sometimes you can go to a company and say, you know, I have a really good idea. I'd like to use your drug. And they'll say, okay, Dr. Kaufman, here's our drug. Go use it. We think that's a great idea. Sometimes a study may be industry sponsored. That means that there's a drug company who has a financial interest in developing the drug, and they want to test it, and they typically will pay to get the study done, and they sponsor the study. Thirdly, the government can sponsor drugs. So the National Cancer Institute has a very active office that is involved in identifying new drugs. They try to convince drug companies to give them some of the drugs that they like, and then they send that out, usually in a competitive manner, to investigators who might want to test it. We have established a number of what are called cooperative groups. These are national networks of hospitals that get together as a group and try to pick the best drug options from both industry and from the government and from the members of the group, and it's a way to test them in a larger number of patients much more quickly. So some of the cooperative groups have probably up to 100 different hospitals that may be involved, and so for example, one of the very active groups is the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group. They have a melanoma committee. That committee gets together twice a year, and all the melanoma experts, melanoma nurses, actually go and meet. We discuss what the best options are, and then we can actually get a study open at 100 hospitals practically overnight. And we can, and many of the pivotal studies have been done through the cooperative groups. Next. So again, this is just, I actually just listed a number of cooperative groups that specifically have an interest in melanoma. So the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group is one. The Southwestern Oncology Group is another one. Although they were originally named for where they started, they're now both national networks. So they're in cities everywhere. So they kind of break things up. So in Chicago, for example, Rush University, Northwestern are members of the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group, and Loyola is a member of the Southwest Oncology Group, and this is a way to, again, develop this kind of national network. There is a radiation therapy oncology group that tends to focus on studies with radiation. There's a European cooperative group, And most recently, we've actually, the National Cancer Institute has sponsored a cancer immunotherapy trials network, and Dr. Gajewski at the University of Chicago and me at Rush are part of that. And this is a group that's designed specifically to bring immunotherapy agents to patients with melanoma and other cancers as well. So one of the words you're going to hear is eligibility criteria. So now, although I know we had some questions earlier, so why can't I just go on a study if I want to? Okay, so unfortunately, you can't do that. So there are these criteria that you have to meet that we call eligibility criteria. So these are factors that relate to patients, to sometimes to the tumor, and to the study that really helps us to pick the right kind of patient to enter into that study. Patients will typically have to meet all of those criteria, and these are criteria that are really developed and approved before the study even starts. So we don't make this up along the way. Somebody can't tell you, you know, I don't like the way your hair color is or the way your blood work came out today, and therefore you can't go on the study. This is done all up front, and there's a reason for it. So next slide. Part of the reason is that we really want to help select the patients most likely to benefit from a particular agent or a particular study. So we don't want to waste people's time if they're unlikely to benefit. So sometimes when there's a brand new agent, we can open it up to various types of cancer because we may not know in which it will work best. Sometimes we do. So let me give you a really good example, and that's the BRAF inhibitors. So in the early days, this was tested in everybody, and we didn't really know that we should be testing patients first to see if they actually have a mutation in the BRAF, because it turns out if you don't have the mutation, you absolutely will not respond to the drug. So nowadays, and I think part of the reason that these studies were so successful so quickly is that patients were tested up front. So the 675 patients that were in the pivotal phase 3 study came from a group of about 2,100 patients who actually were tested initially, and only patients who had the mutation were able to enter into the study because they're the only group that could really respond to that drug. And so it was obviously not only to the drug's advantage, but it was to a patient's advantage that if you didn't have this mutation, you shouldn't be wasting your time because you were not going to respond. We also want to avoid unnecessary harm to patients. So some immunotherapy drugs, as some of you may know, can be kind of harsh. And we don't want to put a patient on a study if they're likely to get harm. The last thing we want to do is actually make somebody worse because of the drug we gave them compared to the disease that they have. And finally, we need to standardize the population so we can make some comparisons. So the only way we really move forward is if we have a group of patients that's as similar as possible to look at. So what we would do in an adjuvant setting, so for example, patients who have stage 3 melanoma may behave very differently than patients with stage 4. So, and in fact, it's turned out that has actually been the case. So if you look at interferon as a drug, very effective in stage 3 and really minimally effective, if at all, in stage 4. On the other hand, interleukin-2 has been very effective in stage 4 and has really just never shown a benefit in stage 3. Now, if we did a study and we included stage 3 and 4 patients, we might actually never learn that because they might be mixed up. So we really try to identify a group that's similar, and that allows us to test different drugs in a similar population. So why do people typically not qualify for a study? Well, they might not have the right type of tumor. So interleukin-2 works very well in melanoma. It works very well in kidney cancer. As far as we know, it doesn't work too well in some other types of cancer, so we wouldn't want to waste time putting patients, for example, with pancreatic cancer on an interleukin-2 study because we have no sense that it might work there. Again, patients might have the wrong stage of disease. Sometimes prior therapy makes a difference. So if you've had something, it may prevent you from responding well. Medical conditions can be a problem. So if you have a drug that may have some possible heart effects, that may cause people, for example, to be prone to heart attacks. You don't want to put somebody who may have be prone to heart attacks onto that particular study. And then we look for things in the blood work, the EKG, x-rays. Sometimes we want to measure the tumor, and a patient's tumor may be too large. We may think that this patient's too advanced, and for example, a drug like ipilimumab, the Yervoy, takes a long time to work. It could take up to a year to work. So if somebody has a very large, rapidly growing tumor, this may not be a great study for them. Sometimes the tumors are too small. There's nothing to measure, and we really want to measure the effect. Sometimes patients who have tumors in the brain are excluded from study or in the bone because we think that they're less likely to respond. More and more these patients are being included in studies, but let me tell you the real reason they're excluded. Some drugs just don't get into the brain. So again, if you were to go on a study and you had something in your brain and we're about to give you a drug that will never even get to the tumor site, it's not in a patient's best interest to do that. If we know that the drug gets to the brain, then I think it makes all the sense in the world to do that. Sometimes patients require other treatments. So somebody who may be having a lot of pain at a site, we may want to give them radiation, or we may want to do something else to immediately address that. And sometimes the life expectancy is just too short, so we want to make sure that the drug will have a chance to work in a patient. Next. So some of the other things that are involved that you're entitled to know, you should understand why a particular study is being done. So the drug that you're getting, how does it work? Is it an immunotherapy? Is it a targeted therapy? Is it a chemotherapy? Is it some combination of those? What has been the success rate so far? And you can ask that. What is the success rate in a mouse? What is the success rate in a human? And what are the possible side effects? Even in drugs that we're testing for the first time, we often have a pretty good idea of what types of side effects we might generally get. You will be asked to sign a piece of paper called an informed consent. This is a document that contains a lot of information. I think I have a slide coming up on all the information that's there. If you were asked to be in a study and there's not an informed consent, you should be questioning that, because that is yours to keep. You should get a copy of that, and that gives you all the information you should ever need, including how to contact the people responsible for the study. You may have to undergo what's called baseline testing. So this is often some blood works, typically CAT scans, sometimes an MRI, and that typically is done right before. Part of the reason is to make sure patients are eligible, and the other thing is that we want to see the full effect of whatever we're doing on a patient. So if we want to look at the effect of a drug to shrink a tumor, we want to measure the tumor right before we give the drug, so we can then get a scan at the other side and see what the impact has been. If we don't do a scan up front at baseline, we may never know if it's actually working or it's not working. We would have no way to really figure that out. The study treatment, you can ask when you'd be treated, who's going to treat you, how is that going to happen. Some of our drugs are intravenous, some of our drugs are oral medications, some of our drugs are done in the hospital, some are done in the outpatient setting, and some can be done at home. Follow-up. How long does treatment go on? So in some studies, treatment will go on as long as patients are responding. In some studies, they only go on for 3 or 4 treatments, and then it's stopped. And then typically we will look at patients again and sort of figure out what they're doing. And then what are the alternatives? What if you don't do a particular clinical trial? What else could you do? Is there another clinical study? Is there another therapy that could be done? So the general way that we determine whether something works is something we call response criteria. So over time, we have actually evolved a set of measures that really tell us how things are doing, and this is a way we can communicate with people really all over the world. So we have to be able to measure responses. Most of the time we're actually looking for some sort of radiologic imaging. So we like to use CAT scans. Sometimes we use PET scans. They're not quite as accurate in terms of measuring things out. Sometimes for certain locations like the brain we'll use an MRI. Sometimes we'll measure things on the skin. And then we have criteria. So we typically will call a complete response when all tumor goes away. Now, obviously, this can only happen in patients who actually have some tumor to measure. And it has to be gone and it has to be gone for at least a month. A partial response, what that means to an oncologist, is that tumor has shrunk by 50% or more. And there's quite a range in that. So a tumor may shrink by 50%, or a tumor may shrink by 99%, and it will all be a partial response. Progressive disease means the tumor has typically grown by more than 20% or 25%, or new tumors have come. And stable disease is anything in between. And as you saw this morning with the ipilimumab slides, some patients will actually progress and then regress. And so that's actually leading to some confusion about these criteria. So because of that, and ultimately because we want patients to live longer, we sometimes will look at survival, how long patients live without disease as another endpoint. Next. So this is the informed consent. The informed consent will tell you everything about the trial, what else you can do. It should tell you if there's any costs that you're gonna see, and it should tell you why you might be stopped, and you really are required to sign it. So, and again, you're required to get a copy. So if that's not happening, you probably should really think about what you're getting into. Next. Now again, before you see a study or hear about a study, we have a very complex mechanism for studies to be reviewed. And that's reviewed at both the local level and often at the federal level. So every drug study will actually get reviewed by the FDA. They will weigh in. They know what's going on. We can't just give you a drug that we found in our lab somewhere without their knowledge. On the local level, the review is usually done by an organization called the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. And the IRB is really designed to protect patients. That's their sole job. And what they do is they will look at every study we're doing, they will review our informed consent, and they will make recommendations about what they think in terms of whether the study is acceptable or not acceptable. So I can tell you that, again, some of the things we spend a lot of our time on in the evenings and weekends is really responding to the IRB. So they may want additional measures to make sure a drug is safe. And so this is really very carefully reviewed before we're actually able to have an approved study and be able to offer it to patients. Because I know a lot of times my patients say, we know you have a study coming up, why is it not ready to go yet? And the reason is because we have to send it to lots of committees to look at it first. And again, what they're looking at are things that really protect patients. And the questions that they ask is this study really of potential benefit to patients? Are there too many risks for a patient? And they'll make an assessment of whether or not it's acceptable or not. They have to issue to us in writing that it's okay. They will review any changes we make to the study as we go along. If a patient has a side effect, we actually report it to them. My research nurse, Andrea, is at the back table there, and she spends much of her time telling the IRB what side effects have gone on in patients, and they may decide that, well, we've had too many, maybe we need to do something to address that, or maybe they'll say, actually, it's not so bad and this study can continue. So we're always reviewing the study almost on a daily basis. And again, as I mentioned, it's actually as these studies get reviewed elsewhere, the FDA reviews them. If there's recombinant DNA or live vectors, there's actually an office at the National Institutes of Health called the Office of Biotechnology Activities. They review them for safety with respect to recombinant DNA. If the study is sponsored by the government, it's typically reviewed by the National Cancer Institute. Places that have established cancer centers will have a separate review from the IRB. And many times there's local biosafety committees, there's data safety monitoring boards, and sponsors of the studies will look at them as well. So just to give you an example, if we're doing a drug company study and we have a side effect, we have to actually report it to every one of these committees separately. And if any one of these has a comment and asks us to change a word, we have to let every other one of these committees know. So this is why sometimes it takes a while to do clinical research. So again, this is for your benefit, things that you should be asking when you're considering a clinical study. What is the study about? What's the goal of the study? Is the goal to try to improve survival? Is the goal just to look at a blood marker? Who's sponsoring the study? That's sometimes a question worth asking. What are the inclusion criteria? What are the benefits? What are the risks? What are the alternatives? What else could I do? If I do this, will I be eligible for other studies? So some studies actually want patients who've not had any other treatment. So they want to get people early, and they want to try to prove that getting access to this drug early first is better. Some studies actually want patients to have failed something, so they want them to try something else first before they come to this. So different studies have different reasons for being, and that's an important question to ask. So if you get some treatment, it may take you out of contention for certain trials, but it may put you in contention for other studies. You know, what's in place to protect you from potential side effects? What's required? How often will you have to come in? What happens when the study ends? Some studies want to follow patients as long as possible. Other studies will stop and you won't have to deal with them again. What happens when it's over? Can you leave the study at any time? Most studies, it is your right to leave whenever you want to. So you can do that for all sorts of reasons. But most of us like you to stay in a study if you commit to it. And then how will results be disseminated and determined? So if things change, are you going to be notified? Will you know? So again, I think what I spend a lot of my time with my patients doing is trying to put the various options in order. So oftentimes we'll have standard therapies. We're lucky enough now that we have several treatment options for patients, and then we have clinical trials and experimental therapy. It's important to know what's available. So what are all the options that somebody might have? What are the eligibility criteria? What do I qualify for? What will I not qualify for? And then we've got to put it in order. And I think it's really important that it's not even that one size does not fit all. It's that every patient is unique and an individual. And with melanoma, we sometimes have to really organize this differently for one patient than the other. So I think you've already heard today that we have very helpful family members. We have helpful friends. We go to the internet. We get overwhelmed with information. And what's good for another person may not be good for you. And so sometimes we really have to sit down and individualize things. And we really just have to find out what works in you. Finally, if you are interested in clinical trial, what do you do? And as you can imagine, after all I've said, clinical trials are always evolving. They're opening, they're closing, they're moving all the time. So it's really hard to make a slide and give you a presentation on what's actually happening because it changes so much. The first source is you can ask your doctor, whoever you go to. Some doctors are engaged in clinical research, other doctors are not, but that could be a first start. You can say, do you know of any clinical studies? If your doctor doesn't know of any studies, you could check at the hospital. Are there any other doctors at your hospital that might be involved in a clinical study? Cancer centers are great resources. So an established cancer center has a mandate by the federal government to be involved in clinical trials. Cancer centers have a lot of freedom in many areas, but one of the absolute requirements is that they engage in clinical research. So if you go to an established cancer center, you're more likely to find clinical studies. We have in Chicago, with help from Skin of Steel, put together a website, www.chicagomelanomaconsortium.com. This is a listing of all the clinical melanoma studies going on in Chicago. And the way that this works is anytime an IRB approves a trial here, we get a copy of it in our office, and my nurse, Jill, will then actually post it on the website. So we are happy to have you go to that website. We try to keep that up to date, and that will tell you where the studies are locally in the area. We welcome every hospital and every institution to send us that information. Finally, the National Cancer Institute maintains a database. You can get there by going to the clinicaltrials.gov or you can call 1-800-4-CANCER, and there will be a live human being there, and you can tell them where you are and what kind of study you might be interested in. They can give you a listing. Increasingly, there's been a requirement for all studies to get posted at that site so patients can have access. And the Melanoma Research Foundation also does maintain an up-to-date website, and there are people that can help you there. The local American Cancer Society, although they don't actually give out specific information, they're also a great resource for connecting you to established cancer centers. And you can find out what's going on. It's a very busy time in the field. I personally, right now, we have 13 active studies going on at Rush. And I think most of my colleagues also have quite a few studies, and we often will send patients from one place to the next if there's a study that might be appropriate for them. So finally, just to some concluding remarks, clinical trials really give us important results that make a big difference. We've certainly seen that this year with the approval of 2 new drugs in melanoma. There are many different types of trials, and you can be involved in sometimes as many as you'd like to be involved in. But we do have a lot of guidelines and protocols that we have to follow. I think that there is a lot of oversight that really helps protect subjects who choose to go into clinical studies, and your participation really helps us get new knowledge, and I think has led to improved therapy for patients. And in fact, there's a great slide that I probably should have brought, and what it basically shows is that almost every year, if you look over the last 20 years, survival has been getting better and better and better and better in melanoma. And lastly, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take 1 or 2 questions now. Can you go through all phases of a clinical trial? Typically the answer is no, because many trials, if you've already had that drug, they'll exclude you. On the other hand, sometimes there are specific studies. So for example, we're doing a vaccine trial now, and we actually have what's called an extension study, which is really a different study, and it says that anybody who was on the first study who then would benefit again, they're actually able to go on. So sometimes the answer is yes, and most of the time the answer is no. Right. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, so it's a good question. The question is the control groups and what are they going to be? Again, a control group can be placebo. As you might imagine, that's a hard sell to most patients. And there are some questions about how ethical that is. I know a number of places in Europe have really gone away from using placebo, so the next best thing is the standard of care. And yes, I think we're going to be seeing the new standards as control groups in these studies. Sometimes studies will get away from that by doing what's called crossover. So if you do get the standard and you don't respond, you're allowed to then do what's called crossover and then get the other treatment. And so I think there's some clever ways that we can assure that patients can get access to drugs. So this is an ongoing source of discussion and debate, and I think it's going to be something that continues to evolve, and that we're probably going to need to work with patient advocate groups and the academic community to really come up with better designs that make more sense for patients. It's always a little bit of a problem because we want to get new things out to patients, and it may sound sometimes like the goal is to avoid that, but we also don't want to do things that don't work and that can harm patients. And so it's a difficult balancing act. I do think that for the most part we've gotten better at this, and we are getting things out sooner and faster, and we've been kind of clever with how we're moving things forward. And actually I have to say, as somebody who has spent time at the FDA, really talking to them at both the early and late phases of some of these trials, I think they've been great partners. So they certainly understand the problems that the melanoma patients are facing. They want to get things done quickly, and sometimes they've been great about making recommendations and coming up with ways to sort of speed the process up. So I'm very encouraged by what's going on right now in the community at large. Great.